The arrival of Deathworlders. Commander Zarnak stood at the edge of the observation deck, his multiple eyes scanning the dark sky as the first transport vessel cut through the atmosphere, its massive engines glowing like fire against the blackness of space. The sleek, angular ship was unmistakably human in design, rough around the edges, yet strangely beautiful in its defiance of gravity. Zarnak's antennae twitched in anticipation as the vessel's descent slowed, its heavy body making a soft thud as it touched the ground of the alien planet. The alien species watching from the observation deck, including Zarnak and his lieutenant, a tall, lean creature named Axarath, had heard the rumors. Earth's warriors, known as Deathworlders, were renowned across the galaxy for their sheer strength, ability to survive in hostile environments, and their seemingly unbreakable will. No one knew what to expect when these humans arrived for the training sessions on their alien world, but one thing was certain: they were not to be underestimated. Lieutenant Xerath, Zarnak's voice was low, rumbling with both authority and curiosity. "Ready the team. Prepare to observe, and keep your distance. These humans are unpredictable." Xerath nodded quickly, his silver skin reflecting the early morning light. His species, like many others, had evolved in peace, their existence peaceful and stable for centuries. But humanity, these Deathworlders, were an unknown, and unknowns were always dangerous. As the transport ship's landing ramp extended, a faint hiss of compressed air filled the silence. The first human stepped out onto the alien soil. She was a woman, her short-cropped hair blowing slightly in the wind as she adjusted the heavy, reinforced suit that clung to her body. Behind her, several other humans followed, their faces expressionless and focused. None of them seemed to struggle with the gravity, which was 1.5 times that of Earth's. Zarnak's mandibles clicked together in surprise. These humans were different from anything his species had encountered. They moved swiftly and without hesitation, their boots crunching against the terrain as they gathered in a loose formation. Their leader, a man with sharp features and a commanding presence, stepped forward. "All right, maggots," the man shouted, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Welcome to Hell. Time to start your real training." Zarnak watched, his eyes narrowing. Hell. The concept was unfamiliar, but the humans' readiness to face whatever came next was clear. The training was about to begin, and Zarnak could already sense that these Deathworlders were about to shatter everything his species had known about warfare. The unseen strength. The sun had barely risen over the alien horizon when the Deathworlders began their next trial. Zarnak stood on the edge of the observation platform, watching as the humans filed out from their barracks, clad in their reinforced suits. Each of them moved with a purpose, a confidence that was almost unsettling to Zarnak. This was more than just training. It was an introduction to their very essence. "Are they always this relentless?" Karath asked, his voice tinged with awe. Zarnak nodded. "I've never seen anything like it. They don't seem to know the meaning of the word stop." The alien planet's harsh environment, its thick atmosphere and intense gravity, had already begun to take its toll on the human body. The Deathworlders were pushing their limits with every movement, but there was something about them that made their endurance seem effortless. Their determination was written in every step, every action, and every second of focus. Zarnak's attention was drawn to Captain Erickson, who stood at the head of his troops, issuing commands with a calmness that was almost terrifying. The captain's face was unreadable, but his eyes were alive with intensity. He scanned the group, taking note of each human's movements with precision. "Today's task will be your first true test." Erickson's voice rang out clearly, cutting through the quiet air. "This planet isn't here to be your friend. It'll throw everything at you that it's got. But the question is, can you handle it?" As the humans began assembling their equipment, Zarnak couldn't help but notice how organized and efficient they were. It wasn't just brute strength they relied on. It was their ability to think, adapt, and respond to situations before they escalated. They weren't merely surviving, they were thriving. Erickson turned to face his team, his posture resolute. "All right, listen up. We're going to face down this planet's dangers together. But it's not just about making it through today. It's about proving to yourselves that you can handle whatever comes next. Remember, no one gets left behind." With those words, the Deathworlders began the first leg of their test, a forced march through the planet's harshest terrain. Jagged rocks and shifting sands stretched endlessly before them. The air was thin and the gravity heavier than Earth's. Every step felt like a battle, but the humans pushed forward. Zarnek's species, accustomed to a life of measured precision and calculated tactics, watched in stunned silence as the Deathworlders struggled not with the planet, but with their own limitations. Each human was tested physically and mentally, but no one slowed down. Their faces were set, determined not to let the alien planet defeat them. "We've got this," Erickson said quietly to one of his soldiers as they scaled a steep cliffside. "Don't let the terrain fool you. This is just another obstacle to crush." By the time the humans reached the peak, drenched in sweat, their breathing ragged, Zarnek couldn't ignore the burning question in his mind. How were they doing it? How were they capable of enduring such an immense struggle without breaking? As the humans gathered at the summit, Zarnek and Sereth exchanged a look of disbelief. They had expected the humans to show signs of exhaustion or despair, but instead they were standing tall, as if the very act of overcoming adversity made them stronger. The Deathworlders were not only surviving, they were feeding off the challenges, growing with each one. Zarnek realized something. This was not simply about strength or survival. It was about something deeper, something intrinsic to humanity. A drive, a will that refused to bend, no matter the odds. Erickson surveyed the terrain with a keen eye, then nodded toward his team. "We're not done yet. The real test is just ahead." Zarnek couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. If this was just a warm-up, what would the real trial look like? And more importantly, would any of the alien warriors be able to stand against the raw power and will that these humans embodied? The heart of the storm. The distant thunder rumbled across the alien landscape, a warning of what was to come. The humans, their bodies coated with sweat and dust from the grueling forced march, stood in a ragged line as the final phase of their training began. Zarnek and Sereth, stationed on the high observation deck, watched in silence. The planet's environment was harsh, unpredictable, and unforgiving, perfect for testing the Deathworlders. But what Zarnek had seen so far made him uneasy. These humans were more than just warriors. They were something different. Erickson, still commanding with an unshakable presence, looked out over his team. The storm was closing in fast, its winds howling as they whipped across the barren terrain. Dark clouds churned ominously above, a signal of the planet's most dangerous test yet, an unpredictable force of nature capable of wiping out entire populations in mere hours. "All right, listen up," Erickson called out to his team, his voice cutting through the wind like a blade. "This is it. The storm's coming, and it's not here to play. We're going to make it through this, together. Do not break formation. Keep your heads down and your wits sharp. Move fast and move smart." The humans knew what was coming, and they knew what they had to do. The storm wasn't just a test of survival. It was a test of their ability to think and act under extreme pressure. It wasn't about strength or firepower anymore. This was about their ability to adapt, to endure, and to rise above the odds stacked against them. The storm hit like a wall. The wind howled at an impossible speed, carrying with it razor-sharp sand and debris. The humans, their eyes narrowed against the onslaught, formed a tight moving unit. They had been trained for this, but nothing could fully prepare them for the brutal intensity of a storm like this. Zarnek watched, his mandibles clicking in disbelief as the humans moved with incredible precision. They weren't just trying to survive the storm, they were using it, adapting to it. Their movements were sharp and calculated, as if they knew exactly how the storm would behave. Each human knew their role and performed it flawlessly. One by one, the Deathworlders set up shelter, constructing makeshift barriers from the natural landscape to protect themselves from the worst of the storm. Their agility and ingenuity in the face of this hostile environment left Zarnak speechless. Erickson barked orders, and his team followed without hesitation. They worked as a single entity, each person anticipating the next move, adjusting their position without needing a word. The storm's ferocity was no match for their determination. Zareth turned to Zarnak, his face pale with the shock of witnessing this level of human resilience. They're working together like clockwork, he muttered. It's like they've become one mind. Zarnak was silent, his attention fully on the humans below. He had seen countless species battle against natural forces, but none had done so with the quiet ferocity of the Deathworlders. The storm, as deadly as it was, seemed almost like a game to them. They were not just enduring it, they were thriving in it, the unseen strength within. As the hours passed and the storm raged on, the humans never faltered. Their shelters held, their tactics remained flawless, and their resolve did not waver. Even when the storm reached its peak, with winds that could snap bones and sands that could tear through metal, the Deathworlders stood tall. But it wasn't just the physical strength that impressed Zarnak. It was the heart of it all. It was the way they cared for one another, how they constantly checked on each other, made sure no one was left behind. In the midst of the most brutal storm the planet could offer, the humans showed what Zarnak could only describe as an unbreakable spirit. Their survival wasn't just about themselves, it was about each other. Zarnak had seen many battles, many species fight for survival, but nothing compared to the way these humans fought for their very lives. It was as if their souls were made of steel. The way they moved, their synchronized actions, their unwavering belief in one another, it was something he had never encountered. Captain Erickson, at the forefront of it all, was the embodiment of this strength. Zarnak couldn't understand how one human could carry so much weight on his shoulders and still lead with such calm authority. As Erickson shouted commands, the rest of the humans followed without question, their trust in him complete. Stay low, keep moving, don't stop. We push through this, and we come out stronger. Erickson's words rang through the storm like a battle cry, and the team followed without a second thought. The storm breaks. The storm, relentless and unforgiving, eventually began to lose its intensity. The winds slowed, the sand settled, and the once blinding clouds began to dissipate. When the storm finally passed, the Deathworlders stood victorious, though battered and exhausted. Zarnak and Sareth exchanged a look of amazement as they watched the humans emerge from their shelters, their faces covered in dirt and sweat, but their eyes burning with something that transcended the hardship they had just endured. They had fought the storm, not just with their bodies, but with their minds and spirits. It's extraordinary, Tarath whispered, still in awe. They didn't just survive the storm. They owned it. Zarnak nodded slowly. Yes, they did. And they're not done yet. As the humans gathered together, their gear battered but their spirits unbroken, Erickson stood before them, wiping the grime from his face. Good job, team, he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion. We did it. Now we get ready for what comes next. Zarnak watched as the humans regrouped, already preparing for the next phase of their training. There was no celebration, no time for rest. They were already focused on the future, pushing ahead toward the next challenge. It was clear now that the Deathworlders were not simply a force to be reckoned with. They were a force of nature themselves. The reckoning. The planet's two suns hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rocky terrain. The storm had passed, but the Deathworlders' challenges were far from over. If anything, the worst was yet to come. Zarnak stood at the edge of the command center, watching as the humans prepared for the final trial. The day's heat was oppressive, and the atmosphere crackled with tension. They had faced the storm, but there was something far darker and more dangerous looming ahead. "Are you ready for the reckoning?" Zarnak asked Sareth, his voice a low, rumbling hum. "This will test them in ways we haven't even considered." Sareth looked uneasy. I don't know, Commander. Every time I think they've reached their limit, they just find a way to keep going." Zarnak nodded, his multifaceted eyes narrowing. "That's what worries me. They're not just surviving. They're adapting faster than we thought possible. The reckoning is a test of mind and body, and this world is designed to break even the strongest. We've trained them for survival, but will they be able to overcome what's next?" The final trial begins. The humans had no idea what awaited them. As they gathered for the final stage of their training, Captain Erickson addressed his team with the same no-nonsense attitude they had grown to expect. "This is it," Erickson said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "What you've done so far has been impressive. But now you'll face something that will test your minds, your endurance, and your will to survive. There's no room for mistakes. Do what you do best. Keep pushing." With those words, the human team set off toward the heart of the planet's desolate, craggy mountain range. The path ahead was treacherous, with narrow passes, unstable ground, and hidden dangers that could appear at any moment. As they made their way deeper into the mountains, Zarnak and Sareth observed from a distance, wondering how the humans would handle the unknown obstacles that lay ahead. Zarnak wasn't just worried about their physical capabilities anymore. He had seen their strength, their ability to endure pain, and their relentless drive to push forward. But now, it was the human spirit that would be tested. Would they crack under the pressure of true uncertainty, or would they find a way to conquer their fear and continue forward? The invisible foe. The first challenge appeared without warning. A series of rapid tremors shook the ground beneath the humans' feet, sending small boulders tumbling down the cliffside. Without hesitation, the team dropped into defensive positions, scanning their surroundings for the source of the disturbance. But there was nothing to see. The mountains, silent and imposing, gave no clue to the threat lurking beneath the surface. "Move out," Erickson shouted, signaling for the team to continue forward. "Stay sharp. It's not the ground we need to worry about. It's what's underneath it." The next tremor came faster than expected. This time, however, the ground didn't just shake. It split open. A massive, unseen creature, its body cloaked in the shifting dust and rock, emerged from the depths of the mountain. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its massive claws tore through the earth as if it were paper. Zarnak and Sareth gasped. The creature was unlike anything they had seen before, agile, deadly, and completely invisible unless it was in motion. It was the perfect predator, one that could track and hunt by vibration alone. Erickson didn't flinch. "Form up. Team B, lay suppressive fire. Team A, we need a plan. Now." Without a second of hesitation, the human squad fell into perfect sync. Team B began firing shots that sent the creature reeling. But the real brilliance came from Team A. They used their environment, luring the creature into narrow ravines where its size and agility were less of an advantage. Meanwhile, the rest of the team deployed electronic devices to disrupt the creature's ability to track vibrations. It was a battle of wits as much as strength. Zarnak marveled at how quickly the humans adapted to the threat, using strategy instead of brute force. What had begun as a chaotic situation turned into a textbook demonstration of human ingenuity. The breaking point. But just as the creature was finally subdued, the environment itself seemed to rebel. The mountain gave another violent tremor, and without warning, the ground beneath the humans' feet began to collapse, creating massive fissures and chasms. It was as though the planet itself was testing them, trying to push them to their breaking point. The team had no choice but to run. The sheer chaos of the collapsing Earth made it impossible to navigate, forcing them to rely on their instincts and each other. For the first time in weeks, they found themselves running without a clear plan, each human just trying to survive the uncontrollable onslaught of nature. "Captain," one of the soldiers shouted as they neared the edge of a widening chasm, We need a way across. Erickson scanned the rapidly changing landscape. We'll use the rope system. No time to waste. Move, move, move. Even with the entire ground shifting beneath their feet, the Deathworlders' coordination didn't falter. The rope system, designed to secure them in dangerous situations, was deployed in a matter of seconds, each member securing themselves to the lines and climbing across the treacherous ravines. Zarnak was stunned. The human team wasn't just relying on raw physical prowess anymore. They were relying on each other, using their collective intelligence and experience to adapt to the ever-changing situation. The way they moved in sync, their ability to think and act as one unit, was something Zarnak had never seen before. The final push. After hours of navigating the perilous terrain, the team finally emerged from the mountain range. They were battered, bruised, and covered in dust, but their faces held something Zarnak had come to recognize: the quiet pride of warriors who had faced the impossible and emerged victorious. Zarnak couldn't help but feel a growing respect for these humans. They had shown something more than strength and endurance. They had shown the ability to rise above their circumstances, to think beyond the challenge, and to rely on their collective spirit to overcome the odds. "Commander," Hexarath said quietly, "do you still believe they are not to be underestimated?" Zarnak turned to his lieutenant, his expression solemn. "No, Hexarath. They are more than we ever imagined. We were wrong to think that any obstacle would break them." The edge of desperation. The moonless night cloaked the Deathworlders as they continued their trek through the rocky expanse, their footsteps the only sound echoing across the desolate terrain. The air was colder now, the temperature dropping rapidly, and every breath felt sharp, biting. They had survived the mountain trials and the monstrous predator, but something much darker was on the horizon. The final test, a trial of mind and spirit that would push the humans to their very limits. Captain Erickson's team had been tested physically beyond measure, but now they would face something far more insidious, an enemy that existed not on the battlefield, but within their own minds. Zarnak and Xareth watched from the observation deck, their eyes narrowing as the Deathworlders entered the heart of the planet's most dangerous terrain. It wasn't just the hostile environment that made this place a nightmare. It was what it did to those who dared venture into it. The heart of the planet was alive, but not in a way that Zarnak understood. The air itself seemed to hum with an eerie presence, and the deeper the humans went, the more it became clear this was no ordinary landscape. "Do you feel that?" Xarath asked, his antennae twitching nervously. "It's like the planet itself is watching them." Zarnak grunted, his mandibles clicking. "I've read about places like this in the old texts. Mind-altering environments that distort perception. If these Deathworlders aren't careful, they might lose themselves in the landscape itself." The descent into madness. The deeper the humans ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The terrain itself seemed to shift, the ground beneath their feet warping as if the very land was alive and malevolent. Erickson's squad kept moving, their senses honed by previous trials, but it wasn't enough to stave off the creeping fear that began to take root in their minds. It wasn't long before the first signs of the planet's psychological effects began to show. "Captain," one of the soldiers, Private Harris, spoke in a hoarse whisper, I keep hearing things. It's like there's something out there, watching us." Erickson glanced over his shoulder, his eyes sharp. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the wind's low whistle. "Ignore it," Erickson said firmly. "Focus on the mission. There's nothing out here that we haven't already faced." But it wasn't that simple. The deeper they went into the planet's core, the more they saw things that weren't there. Shadows that flickered in the corners of their vision. The sound of footsteps behind them, even though no one was there. Whispers, soft and unintelligible, brushing the edges of their minds. Harris gripped his rifle tighter. "I swear, I saw something. A figure just standing there in the rocks. It's like it's following us." The group stopped in their tracks. The tension in the air was palpable as each soldier checked their surroundings, their faces showing signs of unease. But even as they scanned the rocky landscape, nothing was visible. Still, the whispers persisted, growing louder, more insistent, until Erickson finally barked an order. "Everyone, get down. Weapons at the ready." For the first time since they had arrived on the planet, the team hesitated. The air was thick with an unnatural pressure that weighed on their minds. Every sound, every movement felt exaggerated. The soldiers were on edge, their nerves frayed from days of constant battle. But now, it was as if the planet itself was wearing them down. The test of will. Zarnak and Terath continued to watch, growing more concerned as the humans' behavior became increasingly erratic. They had faced physical trials, but this was something entirely different. The humans were resilient, but how long could they withstand this sort of psychological warfare? "What is it doing to them?" Xarath asked, his voice strained. "They're not fighting enemies anymore. They're fighting themselves." Zarnak's eyes flicked to the humans below. He could see the tension building as Erickson continued to bark orders, but even the captain, usually so confident and composed, was showing signs of strain. His jaw was clenched, and his movements had become more rigid. "It's the planet," Zarnak muttered. "This is no accident. The land is designed to break even the strongest minds. It's forcing them to confront their worst fears, their deepest insecurities. It's a test of will, but it's also a game of survival, in a way that none of us fully understand." The whispering voices seemed to get louder, filling the soldiers' minds with doubt, with fear, and with the idea that they were truly alone. They had fought monstrous beasts, survived brutal conditions, and conquered seemingly insurmountable challenges, but nothing had prepared them for this, an enemy that didn't need weapons, didn't need physical strength. This enemy was invisible, haunting their thoughts, forcing them to question their very sanity. Erickson's voice cut through the rising tension. "Keep moving," he ordered, but the hesitation in his voice was impossible to ignore. The soldiers continued forward, each of them battling not just the landscape, but their own minds. Every step was a struggle, as though the ground itself was pulling them deeper into its grasp. The crucible. Hours passed, and the Deathworlders had descended further into madness. The whispers weren't just in their ears anymore. The soldiers were speaking to each other in fragmented sentences, their eyes glazed over with the strain of their psychological battle. Harris, once a proud and capable soldier, was now mumbling to himself, his hand shaking as he gripped his weapon. I can't take it anymore," Harris whispered, his voice trembling. It's in my head. It won't stop. The voices, they won't stop." Erickson halted his team, looking around with a stern expression, but even his eyes betrayed a hint of the pressure they were all feeling. "Harris, focus. You're stronger than this. We've faced worse together." But Harris couldn't hear him. The whispers had taken over his mind, and he was spiraling, slowly losing himself to the planet's psychological assault. In an instant, Harris dropped his rifle and took off running, his movements erratic. "No," Erickson shouted, but it was too late. Harris was already lost to the madness. The breaking point. As the team scrambled to regain control, Zarnak and Xarath exchanged a look. The Deathworlders had fought through the toughest trials, but this was the real test. The psychological warfare of this alien world had proven to be a far greater enemy than anything they had faced before. Would they be able to recover, or would they fall apart under the weight of their minds? Zarnak found himself rooting for the humans in a way he hadn't expected. If they could overcome this, it would show the true depth of their strength, the strength of their minds, their hearts, and their spirit. "Xarath," Zarnak said, his voice unusually quiet. "Watch closely. This is where their true resilience will show. If they can face this and push through, they will truly be unstoppable." Xarath nodded slowly, his eyes filled with anticipation and concern. "We've seen their bodies break, their will tested, but this is different. This is the mind. Will they make it? Into the abyss. The air was thick with tension, each breath feeling heavier than the last. The Deathworlders had entered the final stretch of their trial, their minds and bodies battered, but not broken. Yet the alien landscape had one final lesson to impart, one last hurdle designed to push them into the unknown. The team, led by Captain Erickson, could feel the very ground beneath them change. It wasn't just the oppressive atmosphere or the whispering voices now fading into the background. It was the silence. A suffocating, unnatural quiet had descended on the group, deeper than anything they had felt before. "We're almost there," Erickson muttered to himself, though he had no idea what that really meant anymore. The boundary between reality and the planet's manipulative grasp was starting to blur. They had fought monsters, survived storms, and outsmarted the terrain. But none of that had prepared them for this final challenge. The landscape seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, an unbroken sea of barren rock and cracked earth. No landmarks, no signs of civilization, nothing. The vast emptiness of the planet had consumed all the sound, all the sensation, leaving only the faintest hum of dread hanging in the air. Zarnak and Sarath continued to monitor the humans from above, their eyes darting nervously across the terrain. "I've never seen anything like this," Sarath said, his voice thick with unease. "The planet has done something to them. They're not just fighting the environment anymore. It's like the planet itself is trying to erase them." Zarnak's mandibles clicked. "It's not the planet. It's the humans. This trial, it isn't just physical or mental. It's spiritual. The land is trying to strip away everything that makes them human." A walk through darkness. The silence seemed to deepen as the team pushed forward. Every step was slower, more deliberate. Their senses were overloaded, struggling to process the sheer nothingness around them. The ground beneath their boots felt like it was sinking, as though the very earth was conspiring to drag them into the abyss. As they moved, the human squad began to experience something they had never encountered before, the sensation of being utterly, completely lost. Not physically, but mentally. It was as though the planet was trying to make them doubt everything they knew. The world seemed to close in on them, pressing down on their thoughts, twisting them until nothing felt real anymore. Erickson could feel the change in himself as well. His once steadfast gaze wavered for a moment, his grip on his weapon tightening as his mind fought to maintain focus. He wasn't just leading his team anymore. He was fighting to keep himself together. The darkness wasn't just a physical absence of light. It was a psychological void that consumed everything. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every flicker of movement seemed unnatural. Every step forward was a descent deeper into an internal void where doubt, fear, and anxiety reigned. It was an enemy unlike any they had faced. This wasn't something that could be fought with weapons or tactics. It was something that demanded complete mental fortitude, something that preyed on their very sense of self. The dread unleashed. Private Lopes, one of the more experienced soldiers in the group, was the first to crack. The silence had become unbearable, his nerves stretched to the breaking point. He began to mumble to himself, his hands shaking as his rifle slipped from his grip. I can't do it. I can't." Lopes whispered, his voice barely audible. It's too much. What's the point? Where are we going? Where are we even going?" Erickson was immediately by his side, his hand steadying the soldier's trembling shoulders. "Lopes, look at me. We're almost through this. You've made it this far. You're stronger than this." But Lopes didn't respond. His eyes were glassy, his mind lost to the suffocating isolation of the landscape. The planet had taken hold of him. He was no longer part of the team. And worse, he was starting to question his own identity. He wasn't just fighting against the landscape. He was fighting against his own mind, against the creeping, invasive feeling that there was no longer any meaning to what they were doing. I'm sorry, Captain," Lopes muttered, his voice distant. "I can't go on. I'm not who I thought I was." The words cut through Erickson like a knife, But he knew what had to be done. There was no time for hesitation. He had led his team through everything up until this point, and he wouldn't allow them to lose themselves now. "No one's losing themselves," Erickson said firmly, his voice low but resolute. "We're all in this together. Stay with us. Lopez, stay with me." But the damage had been done. Lopez's grip loosened, and he sank to his knees, his mind consumed by the emptiness. It was clear now that the planet was not just testing their physical strength or intelligence, it was testing their will to remain whole. The core of the trial. As Lopez's struggles continued, the others started to feel the pull of the abyss as well. Every step forward felt like it was taking them deeper into the unknown, further away from the world they had known. Private Harris, the one who had almost lost himself in the earlier trial, now stood still, staring blankly into the void. He was no longer aware of the team around him. His thoughts were lost, his body frozen in place. "I can't do this," Harris whispered, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking any louder would shatter the fragile bubble of his own mind. "I don't know if I can keep going." Erickson turned to face him, but this time, his words weren't enough to break through. The planet had done its work. It had broken the bonds of unity, eroded their sense of purpose. They weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting to remember who they were, to hang on to that spark of humanity that had gotten them this far. Erickson's mind raced as he watched Harris collapse, his body kneeling to the ground in defeat. His heart pounded in his chest, but his eyes never left his men. His voice was the last thread of connection they had to each other. "You're not alone," Erickson shouted, his voice echoing across the barren landscape. "We're Deathworlders. We've come this far. We are humanity. We don't give up." It wasn't just a call to action. It was a plea. A plea for his team, for himself, for them all to remember what they were. To hold on to the one thing that made them who they were, their unyielding, unbreakable will to survive. The return of light. There, in the darkest pit of their trial, the planet finally released its hold. The ground shook once more, but this time it was different. A crack appeared in the sky, a burst of light slicing through the oppressive darkness. Slowly, like a sunrise breaking through a storm, the landscape began to change. The oppressive pressure lifted. The air lightened, and with it, the humans regained their bearings. Erickson looked over at his team. They were battered, broken, but not beaten. The final trial was over. They had faced their deepest fears, fought their own inner demons, and emerged victorious. Not because the planet allowed them to, but because they chose to fight back. As the last remnants of the darkness faded, Zarnak and Xerath exchanged a glance. The Deathworlders had faced the unimaginable, and they had overcome. Zarnak, now convinced of their strength, whispered to his lieutenant, "They have proven themselves. Humanity is more than just survivors. They are warriors of the mind." Xerath nodded, "And they're only just beginning."